I didn't wake up the morning my divorce was finalized feeling free. I woke up feeling empty. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, like a sound had been removed and no one had warned me. The other side of the bed was cold, untouched. For months, I had imagined this moment would come with relief, or anger, or at least something loud enough to feel real. Instead, there was just silence. I lay there longer than I needed to, staring at the ceiling fan as it moved in slow, uneven circles. I counted them without meaning to.
1, 2,
3. I used to do that when I couldn't sleep during the marriage. Back then, I thought the problem was stress, or work, or timing. I didn't realize I was already disappearing. Getting out of bed felt like a decision that required permission. Eventually, I stood, wrapped myself in a robe, and walked to the kitchen. The coffee machine blinked 12 o'clock, still untouched since the night before. I pressed the button and watched it come to life, the low hum filling the room. That sound grounded me more than I expected. I leaned against the counter and waited, thinking about how strange it was that the world hadn't stopped. Cars were passing outside. Someone upstairs was moving furniture. Somewhere, people were laughing, arguing, living. And here I was, officially alone for the first time in 9 years. The word alone had scared me once. Now it felt neutral, not comforting, not threatening, just there. I carried my coffee to the small dining table by the window. It used to be our favorite spot on weekends. We would sit there with our laptops, pretending to work, occasionally exchanging comments about news articles neither of us really cared about. I hadn't moved the chairs. One was still slightly angled toward the other, like it was waiting. I turned it away. The divorce itself hadn't been dramatic. No screaming matches. No betrayal that made headlines in my mind. Just a slow erosion. Conversations that became shorter. Touches that felt polite instead of familiar. Decisions made separately, even when we were in the same room. When the lawyer said, "You're officially divorced," I nodded like he had just confirmed an appointment time. Everyone expected me to be devastated. My mother checked on me twice a day. Friends sent messages filled with heart emojis and reminders that I was strong. My coworkers avoided eye contact, as if sadness were contagious. I appreciated the concern. I really did. But what I felt didn't have a name they recognized. It wasn't heartbreak. It was absence. That afternoon, I forced myself to go outside. The air felt sharper than usual, cold against my cheeks. I walked without a destination, hands tucked into my coat pockets, passing familiar streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every place carried a memory. The bookstore where we argued quietly about money. The cafe where he told me he felt stuck, like the word had just come to him that moment. I crossed the street when I saw the cafe ahead. I wasn't ready for that memory yet. As I walked, I noticed how tense my body was. My shoulders were raised, my jaw tight. I had been holding myself like this for years, without realizing it. Always bracing. Always preparing for the next disappointment, the next conversation where I would have to choose my words carefully. I stopped at a small park and sat on a bench. A woman nearby was teaching her toddler how to climb the steps of the slide. She encouraged him gently, clapping every time he managed another step. The child laughed, loud and unrestrained, like he hadn't yet learned the value of holding back. The sound caught me off guard. It wasn't sadness that hit me then. It was something closer to longing. Not for my marriage, but for that ease. That ability to exist without constant calculation. I realized how long it had been since I laughed like that. In my marriage, laughter had become strategic.
timed, controlled.
I laughed to keep the peace. To show I was listening. To smooth over tension. Even my smiles had become careful, as if too much joy might provoke a question I didn't want to answer. I sat there longer than planned, watching people pass. Couples holding hands. A man jogging with headphones in. A woman walking her dog, talking on the phone, sounding annoyed and alive.
Alive.
That word echoed in my head. By the time I returned home, the light had started to fade. The apartment felt different now, not heavier, but more exposed. Like it was waiting for me to decide what it would become. I ordered takeout instead of cooking. It felt like a small rebellion. We used to plan meals carefully, always thinking about health, budget, balance. I ate straight from the container, sitting on the couch, letting crumbs fall without immediately cleaning them up. No one commented. No one noticed. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks.
No dreams. No sudden walking.
Just rest. The next few days blurred together. Paperwork, emails, boxes I hadn't unpacked because I didn't know where things belonged anymore. I found objects that carried meaning once and now felt strangely distant. A framed photo from our first vacation. A sweater he left behind that still smelled faintly like his cologne. I folded the sweater and placed it in a donation bag without ceremony. I expected regret to follow. It didn't. Instead, there was a quiet sense of rightness. Not happiness. Not relief. Just the feeling that I was finally acting without asking for approval. One morning, as I brushed my teeth, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but there was something else there too. A looseness. My eyes didn't look like they were apologizing anymore. I remembered how often I used to practice expressions in this same mirror. Rehearsing calm. Rehearsing understanding. Rehearsing being agreeable. I didn't do that anymore. Later that week, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. We hadn't spoken in years. She hugged me without hesitation, then stepped back and studied my face. "You look different," she said. I braced myself, waiting for the pity, the soft voice, the careful choice of words. But she smiled. Lighter. The words surprised me. We talked briefly, exchanged numbers, promised to catch up. As I walked away, I realized something unsettling. The version of me she remembered no longer existed. And instead of panicking, I felt curious. Who was I becoming? That question followed me home. It sat with me as I folded laundry, as I washed dishes, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. But this time, the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. I didn't fill it right away. I didn't rush into hobbies or self-help books or declarations of independence. I let the days unfold slowly. I listened to music I hadn't played in years. I walked longer routes, just because I could. One evening, while watching a show alone, a scene caught me off guard. A character said something unexpectedly honest, and before I could stop myself, I laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. The sound startled me enough that I paused the show. I sat there, heart racing slightly, like I had just crossed an invisible line. That laugh didn't belong to the person I had been in my marriage. It belonged to someone else. Someone I hadn't met yet. I didn't know then that this would be the beginning of something larger. I didn't know that this quiet moment on my couch would become a marker in my memory. All I knew was that for the first time in a long while, my body had reacted before my mind could stop it. And that felt important. The next morning, I decided to take a walk without my headphones, without a destination, just to see where my legs would lead me. The city was quieter than usual, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I passed a small bookstore and stopped. Something about the window display caught my eye, a stack of old novels, spines faded and slightly frayed, inviting touch. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The smell of paper and dust hit me instantly, a comfort I didn't know I missed. I ran my fingers along the shelves, picking up a random book, flipping it open, letting words wash over me. No one spoke to me. No one watched me. I realized how long it had been since I allowed myself this kind of simple pleasure. I purchased a small collection of novels, feeling a strange thrill at the exchange of money and paper. Walking out, I tucked the books under my arm, smiling at the little weight of them, the promise of hours spent lost in someone else's story. Back at the apartment, I arranged a small reading nook by the window. A throw blanket, a cup of tea, a book propped open just so. I sat there for an hour, letting the words carry me somewhere else entirely. And for the first time, I noticed the quiet was no longer a void, it was a canvas. Over the next few days, I began experimenting with routines I had abandoned long ago. I cooked meals without planning, allowing myself to make mistakes. Pasta boiled over. I burned toast. I laughed at the small disasters instead of scolding myself. The apartment, once a symbol of my failed marriage, started feeling like a place where I could exist without scripts. I started reconnecting with friends. Not the polite check-ins I had forced myself to maintain during the marriage, but honest conversations over coffee and wine. We talked about books, movies, absurd things that made us laugh until our sides hurt. I didn't filter my thoughts. I didn't hold back. And people responded with warmth, not judgment. One evening, I stumbled upon a small art gallery while wandering downtown. A painting caught my eye, a chaotic swirl of colors, messy but vibrant, almost yelling with energy. I realized I had been craving chaos, not in life, but in expression. I had been holding everything in neat compartments for so long that the idea of unpredictability felt foreign. I bought a small sketchbook the next day. I didn't know how to draw, but I didn't care. I filled pages with scribbles, shapes, random lines, letting my hands move without direction. It felt freeing. Each mark was a rebellion against the invisible rules I had followed for years. The more I allowed myself these small freedoms, the lighter I felt. I laughed more easily now, even at things that weren't funny. I noticed the way light fell through the blinds in the morning, the sound of rain tapping on the roof, the random conversations I overheard on the street. Life was no longer something to endure. It was something to observe, to interact with, to taste fully. One weekend, I went hiking alone. The trail was steep, the air crisp. With every step, I felt more in control of my body than I had in years. The city faded behind me, replaced by trees, wind, and the scent of earth. I reached a small clearing, looked out at the valley below, and for the first time, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment for myself, not for anyone else. Sitting on a rock, I let the wind whip my hair across my face, and I laughed. Not a careful, measured laugh. Not one timed for the comfort of others. A real, unrestrained laugh that echoed across the valley. It surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I had missed it. The sound of my own joy filling the air without apology. When I returned home, I noticed subtle changes in how I carried myself. My shoulders weren't hunched. My steps had a rhythm of their own. I looked in the mirror and smiled at a reflection that no longer seemed like a ghost of the past. I started writing again, something I had abandoned years ago when life became too structured, too heavy. At first, it was just fragments, sentences, small observations, little moments that struck me. But gradually, the pieces formed paragraphs, and the paragraphs formed stories. My words became a way to reclaim my voice, one that had been quieted for so long. One evening, while writing at the kitchen table, I caught my reflection in the window. The city lights twinkled behind me, distant and alive. I realized I had been holding my breath for years, waiting for permission to live fully. And now I didn't need permission. I didn't need approval. I simply existed, and that in itself felt revolutionary. I laughed again, softly, remembering how surreal it felt the first time. This time, I didn't pause. I let it roll over me, let it fill the apartment, let it remind me that joy didn't require permission. And in that small, quiet realization, I knew I was finally learning to trust myself. Not just my choices, not just my independence, but my own instincts, my own rhythms, my own laughter. The days continued, each one slightly brighter than the last. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't care as much. I had learned something more important than certainty. I had learned that life could still surprise me, even after loss, even after endings I thought would define me forever. For the first time in a long while, I was awake. Really awake. The morning after that realization, I decided to explore a neighborhood I'd never been to before. I didn't need a map. I didn't need an agenda. I walked with no plan, letting my curiosity guide me. Small cafes with handwritten signs, flower shops bursting with colors, streets painted with murals. I let it all sink in. The world felt larger, not intimidating, but inviting. I stumbled upon a small community center hosting a painting class. I hesitated at the door, wondering if I was too old to start something new, too inexperienced, too uncertain. But the thought of missing the chance to try something pulled me inside. The instructor was kind, patient. No judgment, just guidance. I picked up a brush and let the colors flow. My strokes were messy at first, uneven, unsure. But slowly, they began to form something that felt like expression. Not perfection, not beauty, but honesty. Each swipe of paint was a small victory, a declaration that I could exist, unfiltered, without fear of criticism. Over the next few weeks, I found myself creating more intentionally. A sketch, a watercolor, even a small canvas. Each piece captured fragments of my feelings, sometimes chaotic, sometimes calm, but always mine. And with each creation, I felt my heart grow lighter. One evening, I attended a small gathering of other artists. We shared our work, our stories, and I was struck by the warmth, the absence of competition, the genuine encouragement. I realized how much I had missed being part of a community, not just observing life from the sidelines. Connection felt different now, not obligatory, not performative, but real. I also began reconnecting with my own sense of adventure. I signed up for a cooking class, something I had once loved but abandoned when life became too structured. The first session was messy. I burned the sauce, dropped utensils, laughed at my mistakes. But I didn't care. I learned to savor the process, not just the results. During a weekend hiking trip, I met someone, another solo traveler exploring the trails. Our conversation was effortless, easy, filled with humor and small observations about the trail, the weather, the absurdity of our sneakers slipping on rocks. There was no pressure, no expectation, just conversation, light and authentic. That encounter reminded me that life could offer new beginnings at any moment. Not just romance, not just career opportunities, but friendship, laughter, shared experiences. I didn't need to cling to the past or mourn every detail of what I lost. I could step forward, fully, into whatever awaited. At home, my mornings became rituals of mindfulness. I brewed coffee intentionally, watched the sunlight move across my apartment, and allowed myself to feel gratitude for the small things. The warmth of my mug, the smell of fresh pages from a book, the sound of my own laughter echoing off the walls. I began journaling each evening, not to document, not to analyze, but to honor my experience. I wrote about fear, about hope, about moments of courage I didn't recognize until later. I wrote about laughter, the kind that surprised me, the kind that came when I least expected it. It became a mirror for growth, a record of rediscovery. Friends noticed changes too. They commented on the lightness in my voice, the confidence in my gestures, the sparkle in my eyes. I laughed at their observations, quietly proud, realizing that the person I had been hiding all those years was finally emerging. One rainy afternoon, I took my sketchbook to a cafe. I watched people move through life, some hurried, some lingering, some absorbed in conversation. I drew, not to capture likeness, but to capture essence. The barista laughing with a customer, the child hiding behind a parent's leg, the old man reading a newspaper. Each image reminded me that life was full of stories, and mine was just one of many unfolding at this very moment. I started experimenting with music again. I hadn't touched my guitar since before the marriage, too self-conscious, too wrapped up in schedules and obligations. But now, I strummed chords without judgment. The sound was raw, imperfect, but it belonged to me. I played late into the night, letting the notes fill the apartment and mark the passage of time in a way that felt entirely my own. Each new experience, painting, cooking, hiking, music, taught me something vital, that I could rebuild, redefine, and reclaim my sense of self at my own pace. The divorce hadn't destroyed me. It had stripped away the distractions, the obligations, the compromises that weren't mine to make. I laughed more freely now, without rehearsal or reason. I cried when I needed to, not because I felt pressured to, but because emotions were part of living fully. I started noticing details I had ignored. The way the wind moved leaves across the pavement, the scent of rain on asphalt, the fleeting expression of a stranger lost in thought. By the end of the third month, I felt a steady rhythm to my days. Not perfect, not planned, but balanced in a way that honored my needs. I recognized patterns of fear and learned to respond with curiosity instead of avoidance. I embraced solitude without loneliness. I welcomed connection without dependency. And through all of it, I discovered a truth that had eluded me for years. The ability to laugh from the heart, unexpectedly and completely, is a measure of freedom. It is proof that despite endings, despite losses, life offers new beginnings, and sometimes they arrive quietly, within the simple act of showing up for yourself. For the first time in years, I felt alive in every sense of the word. Not because life had become easy or predictable, but because I had become present, fully, without apology. And I knew that no matter what came next, I had already found something precious, myself. The weeks that followed were gentle but transformative. I began to notice rhythms in my days I had forgotten existed. Mornings no longer felt like obligations. They were invitations. I brewed coffee with care, sat by the window, and watched the world wake up without rushing to catch it. I started keeping a small plant on the windowsill, watering it every day. The growth of something living, fragile yet resilient, mirrored my own journey. I found joy in the little things. A well-timed joke from a stranger, the taste of a perfectly ripe peach, the warmth of sunlight on my skin after a chilly morning. These moments reminded me that happiness doesn't always announce itself. Often, it sneaks in quietly, unnoticed until you pause to recognize it. One evening, I attended a local storytelling event. I listened as strangers shared tales of loss, hope, mistakes, and triumphs. Their voices were raw, unfiltered, human. I realized that my own story, quiet, gradual, full of small awakenings, was equally valid. I could tell it someday, not for validation, but simply because it mattered. The laughter I had begun to reclaim continued to grow. One night, a friend came over for dinner, and we cooked together. We chopped vegetables, seasoned sauces, and spilled flour across the counter. When the pasta boiled over and smoke curled from the pan, we laughed until our stomachs ached. I caught myself smiling at my own clumsiness, appreciating the freedom to make mistakes without judgment. I started exercising again, but not for anyone else's expectations. Jogging along the river, I felt my lungs fill with air that wasn't heavy with tension. My body remembered how to move without restraint. I noticed the rhythm of my heartbeat and how my muscles stretched, how every motion felt like reclaiming ownership of myself. I also began traveling small distances alone, discovering new cafes, museums, and parks. Each solo trip was a statement to myself. You are enough. You can navigate the world without another person's approval. Each experience built confidence, not in grand leaps, but in steady, deliberate steps. There were nights when loneliness crept back in, but I greeted it without fear. I sat with it, letting it pass through rather than fight it. I learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, realizing that being alone didn't mean being empty. It could mean being fully present with yourself. Relationships began to take new forms. I reconnected with family, reaching out not because of obligation, but because I genuinely wanted to. I built friendships grounded in authenticity, ones where laughter, honesty, and mutual respect were central. And slowly, I found that connection didn't require compromise of my core self. It enriched it. By mid-year, I had developed a sense of inner rhythm that felt like a personal sanctuary. I journaled every night, capturing fleeting thoughts, discoveries, and revelations. Sometimes I wrote about fear, sometimes about excitement, and sometimes about the pure, unexpected joy of a single morning cup of tea. The act of writing became an anchor, reminding me of my progress, my growth, and my resilience. One afternoon, I revisited the hiking trail where I had first laughed freely months ago. The sky was clear, the valley vibrant. As I walked, I remembered the laughter, the first one, raw and unplanned, and I felt a wave of gratitude for the journey that had led me here. The trail seemed different now. I felt steadier, more rooted, yet lighter at the same time. I stopped midway and sat on a familiar rock, letting the wind brush across my face. I closed my eyes and listened, to the rustle of leaves, to distant birds, to the quiet hum of life unfolding around me. And then, quietly, I laughed. It was not a laugh of relief or escape. It was the laugh of someone who had endured, who had rebuilt, who had chosen to love life again. The kind of laughter that bubbles up from the heart when fear has been acknowledged and released. Returning home, I found myself cooking dinner with intention again, arranging the table, pouring wine, listening to music I loved, letting the apartment vibrate with life and presence. The space no longer felt like a reminder of what was lost. It felt like a canvas for what I was creating. Evenings became my sanctuary. I would light a candle, read a book, or write letters to myself. Letters filled with gratitude, courage, and self-compassion. I realized that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a continuous choice to honor oneself. One night, as I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman whose eyes were clear, whose smile was unguarded, whose laughter was authentic. I saw someone who had stepped out of the shadows of her past and into her own light. And for the first time, I didn't wish for someone else to see me. I was content to be seen by myself. I realized the divorce had not been an ending. It had been an invitation. An invitation to reclaim life, to rediscover joy, to reconnect with creativity, to embrace solitude, and to cultivate love for oneself without dependency. And in the quiet moments, when the world slowed down and my apartment filled with the golden light of sunset, I laughed. I laughed freely, fully, and without reservation. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had learned the most powerful lesson of all, that happiness can be chosen, nurtured, and created, even after the deepest of losses. I had found my laughter again, and with it, the truest version of myself.